It's very nice to be here, and I'm very grateful for this conference and the organizers for their work and support. And I try to sum up the main thesis of the paper I sent you, and I understand was made available for those interested on the web homepage of the Institute.
It is on the web.
Yes, so I try to sum up the main thesis of it in order to be able to discuss it, but I will not talk about everything involved in the text of it. I will start out from an earlier paper of mine, which was about the earlier constitution of Hungary, which was accepted in 1990 and was in power until January the 1st, 2012, when the new constitution became valid. This constitution was accepted by the so-called National Roundtable talks in 1989-1990, and it expressed a political compromise between the relevant parties, i.e. of the oppositional roundtable and the Communist Party. And there was a third party, just well, they are not really important participants, but that was the original idea. Anyway, so my claim is that constitution was based on a minimum political compromise, which aimed at a peaceful transition from a totalitarian regime to a democratic regime. So they wanted to create a document which will make it peaceful, the transition, and which will be in power until the transition will actually take place. And my claim is that the fact that this constitution remained in power for 20 years was already a problem, because it was not meant for that. It was meant for the transition. And of course 20 years cannot be taken as a transition. And the fact that it was drawn to make possible the transition, it meant that there were no real value basis for this constitution. It was based on the idea of legal security instead of legal certainty, instead of substantial justice or the basic values of the political community. So my claim was that it was value neutral, and that was the basic problem, because there was no reference in the constitution to basic values, so parties couldn't be tested accordingly whether they accept those standards or not. So there was a political impasse, so to say, involved in that original constitution. And now we have got this new constitution, which tries to heal this problem by adding a preamble to this earlier constitution, because basically the new constitution, in 95% it's the same text as the original one, but there are some added elements to it, and one of them is the preamble, rather long, almost 2 pages long preamble, which is called the National Avowal, and which involves, that's my claim, those values which I thought were missing from the earlier one. So my claim is that this is the important part if we are interested in the ideology of the new constitution, in the ideology which actually is very severely criticized in Europe and in the world generally, because it is claimed that it expresses a kind of nationalist revival or whatever, so it does not fit into the framework of the European political community. as I try to explain the values that are mentioned in this national avowal, I will try to show that it's based on the assumption that this is a document which expresses the constitutional history of the country and which takes as its real target to try to update that constitutional history to fit the European context. So my claim is that it is not simply a remuneration of earlier achievements, but trying to adapt it to the new European context. Because of course earlier, when the earlier constitution was accepted, Hungary was not yet a member of the European Union. Okay, first of all, the title. Why is it called National Avowal? Of course, if one wants to see the terminology, one has to be aware that it's partly a nationalist language. It refers to the national values, the national history, the national constitution, and so on. And by the word avowal, it refers to religious tradition as well, to the tradition when this nationalist language was introduced in Hungary at the 16th century. In the 16th century, when the Reformation brought a new phase in the religious history of Hungary, and that was the point when the Hungarian, the original Hungarian kings, the dynasty was left without a possible candidate for the throne, and therefore the debate became urgent that what we need is a national king, so to say. So that's arguably the starting point of this language of national values in Hungarian politics. And in this sense, nationalism and Reformation were born in the same time, and the two languages, the language of nationalism and the language of Reformation, is joined in Hungarian political history. Now, jumping to the present situation, there is another way of criticizing the new constitution, according to which the process itself by which it was accepted was not really the right process. It did not involve the opposition, for example. It was not long enough for a public debate. It was not based on the assumption that you have to arrive at a consensus as far as your constitution is concerned. These criticisms are very nicely put by the two reports of the Venice Commission, and I think that these criticisms are quite relevant, and therefore I accept those criticisms, and I would say that we have got here a legitimacy deficit of the new constitution because it was made so fast, and because it was not successful to involve the opposition parties. Now, what will be the result of that legitimacy deficit? I guess that there are two possibilities. One is that as soon as there will be a new election and there will be a two-third majority, for example, which would enable the present opposition to change the constitution or change a part of it, that it will be just thrown out. But there is another possibility, one which would be, I guess, better for Hungarian politics, that partly by the practice of the interpretation of the Constitutional Court, and partly by the political reconciliation, as I would say, the opposition which was left out from the actual drawing of the Constitution might find its values in the Constitution, because, as I said, 95% of the actual norms of the Constitution are the same as the earlier one. So one can always refer back to 20 years tradition of constitutional thinking, which was accepted by all parties, at least formally. Okay, now let's speak about the nationalist agenda. I would claim that the national avowal refers back to the 19th century as its basic point of reference, when Hungary was a part of the Habsburg Empire and trying to liberate itself from the Habsburg influence. And a generation of reformist politicians tried to get as much independence for the country as possible. That was the age when the national hymn of Hungary was accepted, or at least was created by a politician, poet, Hörcher. And the language of the new national avowal refers back, partly quoting the first line of the hymn, and partly by indirect ways to the national hymn of Hungary and to other texts of the same age, of the 1820s, 30s and 40s. So in this way it tries to establish a continuity in legal political thinking in Hungary, referring back to the 19th century and updating those agenda for the new millennia. And it is done in a preamble, which means that it is done in the Constitution, in that special part of the Constitution, which does not have a normative power, but which must be used in the interpretation of the normative parts of the Constitution. So my claim is that this text is not, in fact, a legal text in the strict sense of the word. It is not norms that are involved here. These are values that one has to refer to when interpreting the actual norms themselves. And by interpretation, I think one has to be inventive, because this preamble refers back to literary texts. So in fact, literary interpretive strategies might be used to make sense of them, and not so much legal interpretation. But of course we cannot know beforehand how the Constitutional Court will actually work it out to make sense of this new value catalog. Another sphere where the new Constitution and its preamble is criticized is, of course, the concept of God involved in it. Now it's a very tricky solution they used. They, as I mentioned, quoted from the national hymn, the first line of the national hymn, and this quotation is used in the preamble as a kind of a motto or invocation. So it's not even involved within the text of the preamble, which, as I mentioned, is not a normative text. So in two senses, it's not part of the text of the Constitution. First, that it's just a motto, and second, it's the motto of the national avowal itself. But in that very tricky way, the name of God is mentioned in this Constitution. Because, as I mentioned, there is a reference back to the national hymn which started with that, and because the claim is that Hungary and Hungarian constitutionalism goes back at least to St. Stephen's 1,000-year-old Holy Crown, and that sort of historical constitution. Okay. And now we are dealing with the concept of the historical constitution. This is a new item in the constitution, and a very important one, I think, because until 1949, Hungary had a historical constitution. It had no written statutory constitution, but a historical one. And the communists in 1949 introduced the first written constitution, which is claimed to be invalid by the new constitution. So what the new constitution or basic law does is turning back to the pre-communist constitution and claiming that there is a continuity between the two because the written statutory constitution of the communists is claimed to be invalid. Now the Venice Commission is criticizing this historical constitution because it is not quite clear what actually is involved in the historical constitution, but that's a problem of the term itself. I mean, by definition, a historical constitution cannot be defined as well as a statutory constitution. But that's a problem of constitutions generally speaking, because if there is a concept called historical constitution, one has to accept that as far as it is historical, it's not statutory. That means that its actual content cannot be decided as definitively as a statutory one. And why is it important to return to that? Partly, as I mentioned, because it's the accepted earlier one. I mean, there was nothing else in Hungary before the communists, so one has to start out from there. And partly because according to the drawing of the constitutional fathers, although we do not exactly know who are the constitutional fathers, but they claim that Hungary has a long constitutional history and one cannot disregard it in a new constitution. In fact, what one has to do is to involve that history in the new constitution. There is no other way how to draw a legitimate constitution. Another dimension where criticism comes is the reference to communal values. Of course, as we know, modern days constitutions are imagined to safeguard the individual rights of the citizens as opposed to the political powers. But this constitution does not want to safeguard only individual rights, but also communal rights, communal values like the value of the family, like the value of religions, like the value of national minorities, this sort of things. And in this sense, it's a very brave, courageous one, because it introduces these new dimensions into the constitutional theory. And I think it's a rather innovative thing to do. And now the question comes whether there is no contradiction between the process of accepting the Constitution and this communal agenda of the Constitution. I would claim that there is a tension here. I would claim that, in fact, with a two-thirds majority in the houses, the new government could have achieved a kind of national reconciliation instead of this straightforward pushing forward its own agenda. And I think that by this it could have been more harmonious with its own ideology of communal values, because the claim is that there is a Hungarian political community, and this new constitution is the constitution of the Hungarian political community. And now we have a situation when this Hungarian political community could not be involved in this process of drawing the constitution. And in this sense, this is a contradiction, I think. And in fact, my claim is even stronger, which is a philosophical claim. My claim is that, in fact, there is here an important reference to theories of communities, like the social teaching of John Paul II, or on the other hand, on the other Christian tradition, on the Reformed Church's tradition, Paul Ricoeur's ideas of political community. And I think that these are very important dimensions that can be interpreted from this national avowal. And in this sense, this is philosophically quite a strong text. The problem is that the political support to that very strong ideological stance is missing in a way. So I feel here a disbalance. And my final point is this. There is a third dimension, as I mentioned, the historical dimension, historical and national dimension. I mentioned the individual and communal dimension to this ideological background of the national avowal. And there is a third dimension, that it is a conservative agenda. And I would draw this reference to Burke, which is there in the national avowal, about a kind of a covenant between the generations past, present and future, which is a direct reference to the reflections written by Burke at the break of the French Revolution. And the claim is that in this way, this constitution actually is expressing its acceptance of this conservative stance. And of course that can be seen as defensive because of course there are other political ideologies that are not included in the text, like liberalism or social democracy or whatever other green ecological ideologies. But my claim is that even if we accept that, yes, this is admittedly a conservative stance, ideological stance, it can be used as a background ideology to establish a national consensus on, as soon as the interpretation of the text will include those other ideologies. So my hope is that through the practice of the Constitutional Court, the references to the other values like solidarity, like the natural resources of Hungary that should be also defended. So by references of these ideologies, the ideological background of the Constitution can be widened up, and this way it could become the Constitution of the whole political community. Thank you for your interesting talk, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much.